Do you love the idea of personal growth but find the practice of it exhausting?
We get it.
We're Brandon and Megan Giggling, growth coaches with the mission to put the personal back in personal growth.
If you want a new way of growing into the next version of you without the frustration, guilt, and overwhelm, you're in the right place.
It's time to rethink your growth journey and make it into something that works for you.
You in?
Welcome to Growth Reframed. Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Growth Reframed. We are so pumped that you are here. Last week, we had, for the first time ever, a guest co-host, Olivia Harder. And so if you haven't yet, go back and have a listen. We talked all about fear, how fear impacts your life, how fear makes a lot of your decisions for you and how it works into your decisions, and whether fear should really act as a motivator in your own life. So again, go ahead, head back, and give it a listen. But this week, we want to dive into the idea of growth rate. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about, not a little bit, a lot of it, about reframing our thinking around the idea of growth. And what does growth rate even mean? Like, what are we even talking about? And what would happen if we started to look at our growth at the same way we look at the growth of a business? And so we're going to dive into it today.
Yeah, I'm super excited that you brought this idea to me, because when you first came to the idea of growth rate, I was like, what exactly do you, like, I know what a growth rate is, but I don't know that I've ever heard people talk about it as far as like personal growth context. So I don't know, maybe I just missed the memo on that one, but if not, cool, let's dive in. And if so, then I guess we'll just have our thoughts that compare against other people's. But
full and fair disclosure, y'all, like, I think I made this up. I think I came up with this. So I'm just going to put a little C above this as a copyright by Growth Reframe Podcast, circa 2023. But yes, so it's weird because I never thought about it this way either. But right now, it's the beginning of the year. We've done this many other years, but we're in the midst of doing a business plan to kind of forecast and prospect where we want the year to go, what we want our yearly goals to be, whether that be revenue, whether that be numbers, whether that be culture and how we're going to establish like building our team and building more people around us. And as we're going through that process, we sat down recently with some other people from our company and we were like, well, what should the numbers be, right? And so when you're typically going to compare, if you're going to compare numbers, if you're going to compare anything really, we always say don't compare to anyone else but yourself. Like if you're going to compare as a business, you should compare to your previous best and try to be beating your previous best. If you're going to compare to anyone else, don't do it. Compare to yourself and where you were before and where you could possibly be. So in that context, we were sitting down and we're like, okay, so this is what we think we could do. This is what we think we want to implement. This is what we want to do for the business. And this is where we want to see ourselves going. And I said, while I'm saying that, full and fair disclosure, we have grown at this percentage rate every year, year after year. And that's been about the average growth rate we've been at. And so this year, when we sit down, let's try to do better than that, but we don't want to get too crazy and be so far beyond that it's impossible to reach. And it's weird because you want to, as a business owner, as a person, and that's what got me thinking about this, you want to establish just a astronomical growth rate. Like as a business, of course, we want to make as much money as we possibly can and impact as much people as we possibly can. But there's also a reasonable expectation behind what we can accomplish with the current team we have, with the current time constraints we have, with everything else. And so that's why I brought it to you. I was like, well, what if you looked at your personal growth journey and your growth as a person the same way we looked at our business's growth? And we're going to kind of break that down today.
Mm-hmm. I think that you had told me that a typical business, if they're growing, if they're not staying stagnant, if they're not about to close the door, if a typical business, and we're going to flip the script to the personal side of this in 1 second, but grows at like 10 to 20% a year. If they're growing, a decent growth rate is 10 to 20% a year. So why do we then think that in our personal lives, we should do a total 180, fix every single thing at the same time, and grow by like 3,000% in a minute and a half? Because that's what we do, right? It's January 1st, and all of us go like, oh, what's our New Year's resolution? And instead of being like, I'm going to do this and make it sort of reasonable, none of us do that, right? We're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to lose 112 pounds. I am going to write a book. I am going to be the best mother. I'm going to become a stay-at-home mom or dad. I'm going to, like, you just go all in. Like, every single possible facet of your life, you're like, yes. And I'm not just going to be a little bit better. I'm not going to be a tiny fraction of a little bit better. I'm just going to be a completely different person. And by the way, I'd like to accomplish that by February 1st. Please and thank you. That's how we think about it. We might not say that out loud, but we're, like, all in on every single subject of every single thing. And, like, also I need it to happen in 3 to 4 weeks. That's not reality. The same way it's not reality in a business. You can't, I mean, you could, but it's not likely that a business is going to grow by 50, 75, 100% in a year or two, right? Mm-hmm. It's not likely we're going to do that in our personal lives either, but we try anyway. And then when we don't come up with that kind of growth rate, we just think that's it. Like, we've just totally failed. We haven't done anything. We've made a miserable embarrassment of ourselves, and we just go kind of down in the dumps. And I think that that's just a dangerous place to be.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I even as you're saying it, I feel like my personal growth head butting up against that, because I'm like, what we're not saying, because I want to be clear what we're not saying. We're not saying don't reach for the stars. We're not saying don't set out stretch goals. I call them stretch goals because they're goals that will stretch you like beyond, like, hey, if the dream scenario happened, we'd be to these stretch goals. We have them for our company. We have them for ourselves. But there's also, like you were just saying, Meg, there's got to be a reasonable expectation of what you can do. And for me, what's more important than what I possibly could accomplish is what can I sustain? Because when you're looking at it even as a business or for us personally, and we've been in a training before where they were talking about, well, if you got all the things, all the benchmarks, you aim for the stars and say this month, within 30 days, you're the best marketer, business guru, whiz ever. You're the best expert in the field. And every single dream and goal that you set for yourselves comes true. You're sitting there with the team that you currently have. You are sitting there, in our case, with the two of us for the most part. So what would we do if all of a sudden we were reaching all of those goals at one time? We wouldn't be prepared for it. We wouldn't be building toward it, and we wouldn't be ready to overcome. And so when I say I want it to sustain, I mean, I want the growth, and then I want continual growth year after year. We've all seen the stories of the people that have astronomical success, and then within a year, everything's crumbled to nothing. I don't want to be that. And I don't think our goal or aim as people, individuals or in a business, should be that way. My goal is not to have the best year I've ever had as a business and then the next year close my doors. My goal is not to have the best year of my life as an individual and then the next year be burnout, strung out, stretched out, divorced, a terrible parent, an anxious ridden, crazy person. Like, that's not what I want. I want something that I can build upon. And what you're talking about when you're saying, well, we want to do all that. Yeah, we do. And that's great. Like, set out some awesome goals, but also at the same time, have some building blocks and a foundation to grow upon. And I think if we look at it in a way of like, okay, to me, it simplifies it a ton. And I was joking with you before the episode, but I'm like, hey, if I say I want to grow 10% this year as a person, right? And it's funny we even say that because as a business, it's really easy to pick a number and say like, well, this revenue goal or this particular key target indicator, this will be, key performance indicator, this will be what tells me that I've grown. But
how do you convert that?
But how is that convertible in the human experience? How is that convertible as an individual? I don't really think it is. But let's just say for some reason, your gut, your intuition, whatever you say, could determine that Brandon is growing 10% this year, or you out there are growing 10%. All I want to do is grow 10%. Sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? But what does it actually mean? But like to me, in the simplest terms, doesn't that give you even a little bit of a sigh of relief to say, okay, I think I could, 10%, sure. Now, if I said 90%, you might be like, oh, or even 50%, oh, okay, well, hold on. But 10% doesn't sound that bad. And then it kind of lowers it doesn't lower your sights, but it lowers the expectation for where you're currently at. Because like my thing is like, if I wanted to grow 10% each year, that would mean a few years from now, if it was 10%, then in like 3 years, I'd be at 30% growth. Well, that sounded a lot better, but you're building on it, and then you're able to maintain the things and levels that you've set, and then also add additional things onto that to be to the place you want to be. But it doesn't have to happen today or next month or next week the way we expect, because we have such a short-term view on everything. Raise your sights and extend your view is all I'm saying.
Right. And I really like the idea of either building blocks or that 10% year after year. Maybe in the idea of kind of like baby steps, right? Like, we don't have to take huge, crazy steps to be going in the right direction. Like, we can take smaller steps that build a great foundation and still be reaching goals. It just doesn't happen as quickly as we want it to sometimes, and that's where we get all tripped up. Like, that's where we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm failing. So for me personally, it's all about like reframing my thinking to understand that moving forward is still a great step. Moving forward is still growth. And maybe it's not as fast as I see somebody else on the other side doing, but that's not for me. That's for them. And I can't keep up with that because my life is not their life. My circumstances are not their circumstances. So what's realistic, what's reasonable for me is not what's reasonable or realistic for somebody else or for you. And we all have to kind of find that place for us, because my baby step might not look like your baby step, but if we're moving forward, if we're gaining momentum, that's the important part there. And whether that's 5% a year, 10% a year, or 20% a year, as long as you're building that foundation, I think that's a great place to be.
Well, and I think you can easily set, like I said, you can set key performance indicators to show that you're actually doing it. Mm-hmm. To me, all I'm looking at, and I mentioned this before, is I'm looking at my previous best. So am I doing better than I previously did? And you could break this down by months, or you could break this down by quarters. But I think by the smaller amount you can break it down, the more you can really appreciate the progress that you're making. Mm-hmm. Because you're constantly and in real time saying, I'm not there yet, whatever that yet is, but I have put this in place, and I've started this practice, and I've really maintained my self-care in this spot. And like those things all add up to build that block to the next thing. But if we're so laser focused on the end result, what are the chances that we're going to lose focus on all the things we're accomplishing already? And just to be real, we've done that in our own lives. At the beginning of this year, we had grand plans, and we still do, by the way. But I beat myself up all the time to say, man, I'm just not doing enough. I'm doing all this stuff, and this feels great. But very quickly after I'm like, yeah, it feels great, then I'm like, but, I'm not doing this, and I'm not doing that, and I'm failing here, and I haven't started doing this here, and I haven't implemented that there. And it's like, again, if I'm trying to grow 10%, I'm just throwing 10% out. I'm not really saying 10%, but if I'm trying to grow 10% as a person this year, in the year, I don't have to do that all right now. I'm doing 1% right now, and then I'm going to add to that. And by the end of the year, I'll be 10% better than I was. The problem is we do two things. We either set our sights ridiculously high, and to be honest, set ourselves up for failure. Not that we actually failed, but for our own self-defeating ways to say that we failed. So we set it so high that we couldn't possibly achieve it because we think that's what we have to do. Or we set it so low that we either don't do anything at all because we don't think any of those things can happen, or we're like, we just want to maintain the status of where we're at, and that's just where we're comfortable. And if that's where you're at, y'all, and that's where you feel happy and fulfilled, cool. Not trying to harsh on that at all. But if you want to extend and grow yourself even 10%, hey, Brandon, 10% sounds good. Then we have to look at it in a different way under a different lens. And that's what we're inviting you to do today. Break it down into bite-sized chunks. Don't look at it all in a huge way and discount what you're already doing, because you're all doing amazing things. I promise you.
Right. And the other way, I think you hit on two of them. You aim too high or you aim too low. I think the third is that you do aim a reasonable amount, but you aim a reasonable amount on too many things, period. Like you're individually, or maybe even 2 or 3 are fine, and you could get there and you could feel really great about that growth rate. But when you're talking about 10 things, now that reasonable growth rate becomes unreasonable just for the sheer amount of things we're talking about. And that's a dangerous place to be too.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right, because you stretch yourself too thin across so many different areas. And y'all, I want you to improve in all those areas. I want us to improve in all those areas, but you can't focus on all of them at one time, especially if they're all brand new to you. Actually, when I was on my reading kick, maybe a year, maybe 2 years ago, and I've recommended this book to other people. I don't think I've ever recommended it on this podcast, but it's called The One Thing by Gary Keller. And if you're kind of stuck in that, I'm trying to do everything really great and I can't seem to get anywhere on any of them, read that book, because it literally charges you with picking the one main thing you're going to be working on and be laser focused on it. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that if it's a goal and you happen to have kids and you happen to have a marriage and you happen to have a day job that you're doing, that you don't do anything for any of those. But what it does mean is you're singularly focused on one of those things. So if you're like you were just saying, Meg, if you're in a place where you're juggling 5 to 10 different balls in the air and you just feel like you're failing at all of them, what would it look like if you picked one of those balls and juggled it all by itself?
Right. And we're totally guilty of this too. Total real life example. We want to add YouTube and add video to this podcast and all these great goals for 2023. They're great goals, but we cannot do all of the things all at the same time. We can't build a website and add video and learn how to post to YouTube and do reels and do shorts and do all of the different millions of things all in the same 5.5 minutes and expect it to be done by end of February. And that's what we do to ourselves, guys. That's what we do. Like Brandon was talking about earlier, oh yes, let's set all these goals and I have to beat myself up. Right, because it's too much too fast. It's great to have those goals, but maybe one of those things is quarter one, and maybe you add on a second thing quarter two. Not like, oh gee, on December 31st, I've decided to add 16 different facets to my personal life or my business, and by February 4th, I expect them all to be done well. No, you gotta learn it, you gotta get into the routine of it, you got so many things to do. Number one, a lot of these things are brand new, so you don't even know where to start. You gotta learn, you gotta research first before you even start the implementation. And then the implementation, just the learning of the routine takes time. You can't just do that. I mean, you got 30, 60, 90 days to even get the routine straight. So we are not looking at quick fixes when we're talking about personal growth, when we're talking about growth rate, when we're talking about business growth. And no matter which way you're looking at it, which lens you're looking through today, none of that happens easily and quickly. So give yourself some dang grace and understand that momentum forward is growth.
Yeah, momentum forward is momentum, but I would be honest, I feel my inner voice getting attacked right now, and he's kind of getting a complex by all the things you just said.
I mean, I was speaking to both of us.
But you're totally right, and it's so easy to fall into that cycle. And so for us, what we challenge you with this week is to look at all the things you're trying to accomplish and think about, what would you want your personal growth rate to be? I get it's a new idea. Again, I came up with it, y'all. Don't forget where you heard it, the Growth Reframed podcast. But when you're looking at your life and you're looking at the things you want to do for this year, what if you took those tasks and you said, okay, I want to grow at 1%, 2%, 10%, 20%, whatever you put to that, and then break it down into quarters and say, well, what would that mean then that I need to accomplish to move forward momentum? Again, not all momentum, but forward momentum on these things. What would it look like to say that I've done it and to build on that?
What practical steps
and then,
are you taking?
Yeah, right. And then once you get there with those practical steps and your key performance indicators, then you back it up more and more and more to say, okay, weekly, this is what I need to do. Monthly, this is what I need to do. Don't get overwhelmed with the amount of things. But to me, at least for me, when it's broken down into smaller bits, it just seems way easier for me to digest. I don't have to bite into all of it at one time. And Meg had to talk to my inner voice just now, and I'm sure she'll be talking to me again after we get done with this podcast. So y'all, it's real. I totally understand it's real. And the need for it is real. But would you rather be making forward momentum or no momentum at all? And so we challenge you to think about your own personal growth rate this week. If this episode touched you, please share it with someone who you know it would help. Please share it over on your social media, but make sure to tag us at Growth Reframed. We love y'all.
Thanks for listening to Growth Reframed. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We would love to connect with you, so shoot us a DM on Instagram at Growth Reframed. We love y'all.